At midnight on October the 4th, the first day of the nationwide invasion, within the boundaries of the south-central invasion sector, according to fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the Trojan shock armies of the coalition invasion forces had broken out of their CCP regime properties and went immediately for the jugular of the nation. Within the south-central invasion sector, there were four major external invasion prongs carried out by the external invasion components, primarily PLA group armies. However, there were also some People's Armed Police paramilitary forces and a Russian combined arms army as part of the external invasion forces, at least within this particular invasion sector. As the forces were now engaged in savage combat throughout this particular area, this region of the country. There was one of the invasion prongs comprised of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Combined Arms Army of Russia. In terms of the total mileage to be driven throughout their particular route of invasion, they, comparatively speaking, would have the shortest of all the external invasion prongs in this particular invasion sector in terms of route mileage, as their primary objective was to drive immediately for Amarillo before the PLA group armies would begin to break off, as the total of 6 PLA group armies and 1 Russian combined arms army, the 41st, would drive north, proceeding towards the city of Amarillo, while shedding off the Russian 41st Combined Arms Army to occupy Lubbock. The remaining PLA group armies would leave one to occupy Amarillo, along with the 6th People's Armed Police Brigade, as well as also the remaining 5 PLA group armies breaking off to assist in the fighting that was going on in the Lawton-Fort Sill area, as well as also moving east and west along Interstate 40, with the remaining 2 group armies driving north and northwest towards Colorado, as Kansas and Colorado would be the final destination for 2 of the 6 PLA group armies that would reach Amarillo. As it pertained to the operations occurring within the Midland-Odessa Twin Cities area, the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as most People's Armed Police units were now organized from divisions into brigades, this PAP Reserve unit was still a divisional formation and comprised of 16,450 troops. These People's Armed Police shock forces were also along with the National Construction and Production Corps' 350th Battalion, which was part of the larger 7th Division of the National Construction and Production Corps, which hailed out of Xinjiang in China. As the National Construction and Production Corps was effectively a paramilitary, civil and military engineering force, the 350th Battalion of the National Construction and Production Corps effectively was organized with a headquarters company, a building material quartermaster company, and also 3 companies of sappers or combat engineer type troops, and also 3 companies of civil engineering forces, all of which were armed with military weaponry and combat trained. However, the 350th would have diverse operations occurring within this particular battle space, which encompassed the Midland and Odessa area, alongside of the brutally fanatical People's Armed Police shock forces of the local Trojan shock elements. As it pertained to the defending forces, if we go to the map of the local area, within the Midland and Odessa Twin Cities area, battalions which were part of the larger 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, which actually had other battalions spread throughout the South Central Invasion sector, some of which were in the Houston area, as well as also the DFW area and the Austin area as well, with the remaining comprising battalions in the Midland-Odessa Twin Cities area, along with their headquarters and headquarters company over their entire brigade, which would command all of the local defending forces, which even included also the 877th Quartermaster Company, which was a reserve unit from the local area. As the battalions present belonging to the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team included the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, as well as also the 1st of the 635th, an Armored Battalion, and also the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion. These Army forces, most of which were National Guardsmen, but again, there was a company of U.S. Army Reservists, were augmented by the presence of roughly several thousand paramilitary forces of the American alphabet paramilitary elements, which included among them the ICE paramilitary branch, as well as also DHS paramilitary forces, as well as also there being Border Patrol and other smaller contingents of other types as well, all of which comprised the paramilitary contingents, which were primarily tasked with essentially operating border security sites. Although deep inside the land, this area was a hub for the border operations which had been taking place in this part of the country. Included in the area was a recently built detention center, which was run by ICE, as well as nearby the forward operating base constructed for and by the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team. Other units that were deployed were in place in order to defend the Midland International Air and Spaceport, as it was called, as well as also the National Guard Armory that was located in Odessa, as well as also paramilitary forces deployed to defend the local power plant, which was the Ector County Energy Plant, a gas-burning power plant located within the northwest of this map. As the invasion forces of the coalition were primarily Chinese paramilitary forces in the form of the People's Armed Police within their 2nd Light Armored Division, as well as also the 350th Battalion of the 7th Division of the National Production and Construction Corps from Xinjiang, the air power provided came from both the People's Liberation Army Air Force, or the PLAAF, and the Iranian Air Force, as the Iranian membership in the coalition not only involved some of their ground forces being deployed, such as those that were now fighting alongside of Pakistani forces in the battle for Albuquerque, but also the air power in this area, as these were the Iranian squadrons, were essentially by the Iranians provided a squadron of F-14 fighter jets, as Iran was the last country in the world to operate such aircraft and had effectively cannibalized other aircraft to keep remaining aircraft flying. However, as Iran had a fairly well-developed defense industry, they were getting better at producing spare parts for these aircraft and were continuing to maintain these weapons, including even with a stockpile, or what remained of which, of American-made missiles such as the Phoenix missiles and others. As also, besides the fighter squadron of F-14s provided by the Iranian Air Force, was a squadron of Su-24 strike aircraft. In the strike or ground attack or even close support role, these aircraft could be highly effective weapons as they carried a punishing payload of approximately 18,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, almost comparable to the PLAAF's heavyweight strike aircraft, the JH-7, which carried 20,000 pounds, roughly, of air-to-ground ordnance, as the PLAAF, of course, providing a squadron of their JH-7s allocated to this battle space, along with the Iranian Air Force's Su-24 strike aircraft squadron, would be able to deliver punishing firepower to ground targets, as well as supporting the paramilitary shock forces of the People's Armed Police below, as also one of the more advanced Chinese fifth-gen fighter aircraft, the J-35A, had been provided in a squadron, as these aircraft initially had been constructed for the PLAN, or People's Liberation Army Navy, in the form of carrier-based aircraft. The J-35A was the Air Force analog to the naval version, as the J-35A, one squadron of which had been allocated to this battle space for air superiority operations in conjunction with the Iranian contribution of a fighter squadron of F-14s. Naturally, the beyond visual range and highly advanced avionics of the J-35A essentially put the F-14 to shame. However, all aircraft that were contributed by the coalition allies were never refused, as the more air power available, the better, as these aircraft could return with air-to-ground ordnance after they had done their air superiority patrols and operations, as the combat air patrols over the battle space below were absolutely a dire necessity in these operations, as early on, all USAF, USN, or U.S. Navy, and Marine Corps aviation assets had to absolutely be neutralized in the early hours of the invasion, which they would be. By between 5 and 5:30 a.m., there would essentially be nothing left of American aviation within the U.S. mainland, as the missile forces contributed, in addition to the very powerful air power, would come from the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades in Mexico, who, in the case of supporting the operations in the Midland-Odessa area, would be firing long-range and quite potent DH-10A subsonic cruise missiles at targets, as well as also they would be launching their DF-21A missiles and also DF-3As at targets in this particular battle space. They would be using their hypersonic missiles on more heavily defended targets, such as those containing air defense capabilities, such as Fort Bliss, Fort Sill, and Fort Hood, all of which had air defense forces and assets present at the time of this invasion. As it pertained to the ground forces, all of the ground forces, insofar as the Trojan shock units in this particular battle space, were paramilitary or parallel military forces. The People's Armed Police were the Praetorian Guard of the Communist Party of China, or Chinese Communist Party. These forces were the most fanatical, most die-hard, and even quasi-elite in terms of their paramilitary status forces that were available for combat, as the People's Armed Police, which was all in the name, armed police, were more than your typical gendarmerie. These were heavily armed paramilitary forces who had highly intense training and even had a diverse range of missions and operations, whether back home or now abroad. As back home, they had done everything from guard Lao guys or slave labor camps to police operations at the national level, as well as also even outright combat against forces in Xinjiang who were trying to resist against the regime, as in separatist forces in Xinjiang who dared try to resist and fight back against the CCP regime. And the People's Armed Police, having had gained ample combat experience over the many years of fighting these forces, were exceedingly brutal in their crackdowns and would use their expertise in counterinsurgency warfare against the civilian population to another level. And not only were they adequate and highly capable forces against insurgents, terrorists, and other guerrilla and partisan-like forces, but they were also fully capable of engaging and destroying actual military forces of enemy nations, as again, they were equipped with many hand-me-down weapons provided by the PLA as all the latest and greatest equipment began to deeply proliferate throughout the massive ranks of the PLA's active duty, reserve, and ready reserve forces. The hand-me-down weapons gradually made their way to the People's Armed Police. One such hand-me-down weapon, which was a mainstay in this particular unit, was the Type 62G or Type 62 Guy, the light tank, which was a highly upgraded system from its original iteration with a brand new turret and armor package, as well as an upgraded gun and fire control system as it went from its 85 millimeter main gun to a 105 millimeter rifled tank gun. This light tank, with greater armored protection, as well as also an upgunned weapons system capable of firing ATGMs and even depleted uranium 105 millimeter tank shells, was more than capable of destroying the military vehicles of enemy nations. And although the M1A2 Abrams, a very highly capable and advanced main battle tank, would be able to easily destroy the Type 62G light tanks, the Type 62G was equally capable of using their range advantage with ATGMs to destroy the M1A2 main battle tanks, essentially making it a more fair fight. Not only that, but at closer ranges, the depleted uranium rounds from the 105 millimeter main gun of these light tanks was fully capable of tearing through the armor of the M1A2, especially at 1,500 meters, as these vehicles, comprising this light armored division, essentially equipped the armored battalions within it, along with their armored infantry forces, equipped with the Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles, which came equipped with a rail-mounted HJ-73C short-range ATGM system, as well as a 30mm autocannon and a 7.62 by 54mm coax weapon. These are very devastating infantry fighting vehicles, and the older Type 63 armor personnel carriers also equipped the armored infantry forces, as each platoon came equipped with one IFV, one Type 86G, and 4 Type 63 APCs. As the militia forces, in addition to the American paramilitary and military forces in this area, were exceedingly well equipped for a militia force, as the militia forces in this area, being within somewhat close proximity to the border, as the border areas of the United States tended to have far more better equipped militias than throughout the rest of the country, and this was more the exception and not the rule, and mainly because some militias were willing to do business with the enemy, and the enemy being the cartels. As weapons proliferated from the failed Eastern European proxy conflict, American weapons often found their way back to America through some dirty channels, as arms dealers from Eastern Europe effectively shipped weapons out of Odessa and other areas clandestinely to countries like Mexico. The cartels purchased these weapons and even resold them to Americans, but not to the American government, but to their people. And as the American militia effectively organized to defend their local communities against all of the foreign criminal elements that made their way into the nation, not counting, of course, the gargantuan Trojan shock forces which sat quietly on their CCP regime properties waiting for the day of the invasion, the criminal elements were far more loud and made far more noise and destruction, and people banded together into militias throughout the country to defend their own communities, taking matters into their own hands. And again, border areas, particularly in Arizona and Texas, but even some in New Mexico, had militia forces that had come to become equipped with weapons such as the American-made PSRL-1 rocket-propelled grenade, which was produced by an American company named Airtronic USA. And this was effectively an RPG-7 copy. And these weapons, along with Javelin, ATGMs, and even some tow missile systems, made their way from Eastern Europe back to the United States via Mexico. There were also other weapons, such as machine guns of different sizes, whether squad automatic weapons or general purpose, and even yet others still. These weapons, and even a very small handful of surface-to-air missile systems, likewise found their way into American militia hands. Of course, this was highly illegal, but it was done nonetheless. As the ends justified the means, they dealt with the cartels as they were technically the enemy. The business was business and would be done regardless, as again, the ends justified the means, and the citizenry badly wanted and needed heavier weapons, especially being in such close proximity to essentially what was considered a lawless narco state to the south, as well as also the criminal elements that had infiltrated from many nations. As the Trojan shock forces at the stroke of midnight had begun their preliminary missile strikes, as well as also massed artillery barrages, including the People's Armed Police possessing their own artillery in the form of the Toad Type 83 122mm howitzers within the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as well as also the slightly more powerful 130mm Type 59-I or -1 howitzers. These howitzers, in conjunction with the missile and airstrikes, had effectively awoken many in the middle of the dead silence of the midnight air in the city of Midland-Odessa. All throughout the battlefront, massed artillery fires were occurring as the external components smashed their way across the borders and into the country, with truly only the invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 with the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army essentially seeing nearly almost no resistance as they plowed their way across the border in the Comstock area / Langtree area, and they would take the state highways, as there was no effective interstates until reaching Lubbock, of State Highway 90, State Highway 163, and then onto State Highway 87, which would take them to Big Spring to the east of the Midland-Odessa area, where they would effectively stop for 4 hours for badly needed fuel, food, and maintenance issues, and perhaps maybe any pressing medical needs, as there was a very tiny company-sized unit of national militia troops, which were paramilitary forces of China as well, essentially the paramilitary version of the National Guard, but for China in terms of their mission overall. The company-sized force would aid in the refueling efforts of the vehicles of the many miles long convoy, as they would need to stop for 4 hours, as it would take approximately that long to refuel all the vehicles, as well as also then driving on to Lubbock, where a similar type of force would do the same before finally going up I-27 and reaching Amarillo, the final destination before the PLA Group Armies would peel off, as they would leave the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army to occupy Lubbock, as the People's Armed Police in the Midland-Odessa area would be engaged in what would ultimately be a 16-hour-long campaign in this particular area, heavily aided by the PLAAF and the Iranian Air Force. the forces would be after what primarily was economic objectives, as not only was the Permian Basin a massive source of oil and natural gas, but there were minerals in this location as well and metals that were of high value to Chinese industry back home. It was incumbent upon the People's Armed Police to capture these objectives, including local infrastructure objectives, such as the Ector County Energy Power Plant, as well as also all of the local water and sewage treatment centers that were located in the area, as well as also there being other industrial sites, such as this oil reclamation plant here, and yet others still. As again, the potash, the lithium, the iron ore, which could be effectively smelted into pig iron for steel production, and the oil and natural gas was a primary objective of the invasion forces of the coalition in this particular region, and the People's Armed Police were left to the task. Although there were still military objectives that had to be met, as Big Spring was not exceedingly far away to the immediate east, the military forces of the United States in this particular area, from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team and others, including also the paramilitary forces in that overall defense force number, had to be completely annihilated, as they still, despite being miles to the west, could serve as a threat to the cohesion of the many miles long convoy of PLA group armies and one Russian combined arms army, the 41st, moving up the invasion route to Amarillo. So the 2nd Light Armored Division of the People's Armed Police would in fact be required to capture all military objectives and annihilate all defending forces, as the military objectives even included the ICE detention center and forward operating base of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion of the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, located immediately south of the city of Odessa in the rural hinterlands along 385, as this particular area was effectively where deserts, grasslands, and scrub woods and mesquite wooded areas all blended together, as it was a diverse and unique location in terms of its geography and topography, with the Davis Mountains not very far from this location as well, as the site of the military and paramilitary forces of the ICE detention center and the forward operating base of the 150th had to be taken with the defending forces destroyed. This would be carried out by the People's Armed Police and 2 companies of the National Construction and Production Corps sapper companies operating alongside of them to capture the detention center, which would be converted into a laogai, or a slave labor camp, as the entire population of the Midland-Odessa area were to be organized into labor brigades. And this was a site that was wanted as much intact as was possible, as it had facilities required for housing sizable numbers of people. As the National Construction and Production Corps 350th Battalion was certainly capable of producing new facilities, and indeed they would, especially on the site of the local international airport, the International Air and Spaceport. They would also utilize other sites like the local municipal airport in Odessa, for example, to build another camp/forward operating base for the local People's Armed Police forces. All of the CCP regime properties upon which these battalions of the People's Armed Police had hidden until this day would be still continued to be used as combat outposts, as they were packed full of logistics, supplies, that is, for these units, which should be used up in the course of this campaign and beyond. As the international airport would be a massively important logistical hub, as it served a massive role in this capacity, as the utility of its runways were undeniable. They would then be able to fly in massive amounts of supplies extremely fast from Mexico from the coalition logistical bases there, as they had had decades to prepare the logistical stockpiles for this entire invasion. The stream of logistics that would pour in from Mexico would simply be monumental after this invasion had ceased. As the hours would go by, the rapidity and shock of the invasion would only get worse, as most of the major battles within this particular area would begin approximately 30 minutes after midnight, after a sizable artillery barrage had kicked everything off in this particular area, along with the tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes being carried out from Mexico from the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades, not only into this, but many other areas beyond, as the militia forces, effectively constructing their own outposts and forward operating base type areas, would likewise come under heavy assault at this time, with even some of the American militia forces attacking the PAP forces, which essentially, in one instance, would be the headquarters battalion of one of the two comprising brigades, which made up the entire 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division. The headquarters and headquarters company and the service support company of the PAP, 2nd Light Armored Division, were essentially the command and administrative elements on the one hand, and also the service support company contained the flying platoon of the Z-8 utility helicopters of the division. These utility helicopters, as the People's Armed Police, of course, had aviation, they had artillery, and they had armored vehicles and more. These would primarily be utilized to ferry out supplies to distant forces in emergencies, as well as also primarily being used for medevac purposes. These aircraft were capable of carrying 27 passengers, of course not counting the pilot and co-pilot, as well as also, in lieu of this, carrying 15 stretchers at a time, essentially 15 wounded personnel on stretchers. These were very capable utility helicopters and would be used widely throughout the course of this operation. As the People's Armed Police was a paramilitary force and not a military force, they went by a completely different set of standards and procedures than did the ordinary, regular military forces. Again, these were the fanatical, quasi-elite, and in some cases elite, as the People's Armed Police did also have its own special operations forces, which were the cream of the crop, including the Snow Leopard Commando unit, which was also serving in this invasion, albeit in another invasion sector. But the People's Armed Police were largely, effectively, like elite infantry, as these were a quasi-elite force overall, with some elite units within it. But, again, they had heavy equipment and did have heavy weapons, such as those passed down from the PLA. And these helicopters in the service support company, again, would be widely used for logistical and medevac purposes, as the service support company contained not only a flying platoon, but also an aviation, rotary aviation maintenance platoon, as well as a medical surgical platoon, as the division's surgeons and also the division-level combat medics were in this particular platoon, who served on the aircraft, on the rotary aircraft, the Z-8s, and of course a division-level maintenance platoon as well, in addition to their administrative platoon, or their headquarters platoon in the service support company. It was effectively a reinforced company in terms of its size, as the headquarters and headquarters company over the division was effectively all administrative in terms of the command elements and the sections, such as their divisional intelligence section and other sections. And in terms of the two brigades, each brigade was comprised of 3 armored battalions and 2 mechanized or light mechanized infantry battalions as well as also an artillery battalion and a SHORAD battalion, in addition to the headquarters battalion, which effectively each headquarters battalion were the command and logistical forces of each brigade. As the light mechanized infantry battalions were comprised of wheeled vehicles, they were primarily equipped with the WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle versions with their 30mm autocannon and 7.62 by 54mm coax, as well as also their armored personnel carrier versions with a 12.7mm W85 heavy machine gun. The light mechanized infantry battalions were very well trained and well versed in the use of anti-tank weaponry, such as this paramilitary People's Armed Police soldier effectively firing an HJO-8 ATGM at this M1 Abrams main battle tank in this suburban neighborhood. As again, they were fanatical fighters, and one of their favorite weapons of choice, as used in Xinjiang, was their incendiary weaponry, such as their Type 74 flamethrowers, which were often used, especially against forces that were hiding in bunkers, buildings, and other hardened areas. As the armored battalions were all track-based forces, they again were equipped with the formidable Type 63G light tanks, as well as their armored infantry being equipped with the Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles, along with the Type 63 armored personnel carriers. As previously mentioned, the National Construction and Production Corps was a combat and civil engineering force of sorts. They were primarily armed with older hand-me-down weapons, such as the Chinese Type 56 assault rifles, which were no longer used in military service and even in paramilitary forces like the People's Armed Police, but instead were handed down to National Militia and National Construction and Production Corps to arm all of them. They were also equipped with the DJI disposable demolition robots, similar to the Army and Marine combat engineers of the People's Liberation Army, as well as the armed quad-legged combat robots, as well as also even the unarmed quad-legged robots, who were used for dismantling and creating obstacles, such as the arms on this particular robot being able to lift and manipulate strands of concertina wire as pictured, as well as also the civil engineers operating standard construction equipment such as backhoes, dump trucks, and more, bulldozers and otherwise, as well as the sapper companies, apart from the civil engineering companies, being able to operate military-style armored combat engineering vehicles. As the sapper company elements pictured here are making their assault from the highway, as they are now on I-20 in this particular image, taking cover and bounding to the concrete walls that separate the highway from an exit ramp that's just below here that can't be seen, and this particular soldier dropping a disposable DJI demolition robot, which was remote controlled, as well as this other one off in the distance, to drive the roughly 450-meter drive to destroy the concertina wiring that was before the concrete T-walls, as each T-wall was spaced between 3 and 4 inches apart to provide gun ports for the ICE defenders that were inside of this facility to fire through. These were the holding tents of the detention facility, and inside the tent were the chain link fencing that effectively cordoned off the tents into large holding cells. This was the processing building, and of course the concrete T-walls were topped with concertina wire, and this HESCO barrier tower, with a guard tower on top, was essentially a guard tower equipped with two M2 50 cal heavy machine guns, as these had been issued to the paramilitary forces in addition to the military forces present to defend these facilities. As again, the facility immediately adjacent and neighboring this facility to its north was the forward operating base created for and by the 150th Engineering Brigade, as the fighting in this area would be heavy as a combined People's Armed Police and National Construction and Production Corps assault would be launched to destroy the defending forces and capture these facilities, especially the detention center, as much intact as was possible. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines, as the invasion was kicking off within the entire nation, including within the larger South Central invasion sector, as the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army seamlessly smashed their way across the border, nearly unopposed. They, in 8 hours' time, would reach Big Spring, where they would take a 4-hour logistical pause to the immediate east of the Midland-Odessa battle space, where the 2nd Light Armored Division of the People's Armed Police was fighting a savage and brutal campaign of subjugation over this particular area, as the economic value of this area was simply far too important not to pursue and take with the utmost vigor and savagery, as the People's Armed Police were a highly fanatical, ultra-loyal, quasi-elite overall paramilitary shock force. These forces had tactics and procedures that were quite a bit different from the PLA or the standard military. The PAP was highly aggressive as a shock force and was tantamount to the Waffen-SS of World War II fame, as this particular campaign would feature heavy and highly savage, devastating combat, not only in the rural desert grassland and mesquite and scrubwood hinterlands of the Twin Cities, but also in the urban center and suburbs themselves. The population would suffer heavily in these operations, as again, those were they who were to be rounded up and used as forced labor for extracting all of the mineral and energy resources in this particular region by the incoming future colonists, as the oil and gas wealth was far too important to the colonization efforts of the Chinese to not deploy highly potent, aggressive forces in this area to round up the civilian population and imprison them and force them into forced labor, as human capital was yet another resource that the Chinese were after in their new colony, as they would essentially, among those they deemed worthy of living, would use in laogai as forced labor to extract the resources throughout the land. And in no place was this any more true than it was in this particular battle space of the twin cities of Midland and Odessa, which would be, for all intents and purposes, razed to the ground by the fanatical, brutal paramilitary shock forces of the People's Armed Police paramilitary. Armored battles would rage not only by the International Air and Spaceport of Midland, but also inside of the city of Odessa as well, as the Alpha Company of the 1st of the 635th Battalion, Armor Battalion of the 155th Armor Brigade Combat Team was deployed to defend the local municipal airport in Odessa, while the 877th Quartermaster Company, a local Army Reserve company from this immediate area, was deployed at the Army Reserve Readiness Center immediately adjacent to the International Airport, with the rest of the 1st of the 635th being deployed in the airport as well, along with even the HHC, or Headquarters and Headquarters Company, over the entire 155th Armor Brigade combat team. In addition to these forces was also 300 paramilitary defenders that were defending the terminals along with the Headquarters and Headquarters Company elements of the 155th Armor Brigade combat team as a whole. As the paramilitary forces broke out of their many CCP regime properties and had begun to go for the jugular, they would destroy and pillage and slaughter almost everything in their wake as they raced towards their objectives. Arising to meet the threat, apart from the local American military forces in the area, were also the militia forces of the Americans. As again, the militia in this area were exceedingly well armed for militia forces, as they were equipped with potent weaponry, which included anti-tank guided missiles such as this TOW with its ITAS system for better targeting, as this militia member in his ACUs here is locking onto a target for an ambush, as these militiamen in this particular animation or illustration are beginning an ambush against PAP forces. So this particular militiaman is firing his American-made rocket-propelled grenade, RPG-7 copy, which essentially, again, was the PSRL-1, which he got through purchasing via Mexico from the cartels from Eastern European arms dealers, just as they would also receive weapons like this TOW missile system and even this M60 machine gun that's being used here. As this militiaman has an M14 battle rifle, this militiaman is using a Remington 700 bolt-action sniper rifle, and the others are equipped with either weapons from home, such as AR-15s or military analogs. The militiamen, again, as well armed as they were, would put up a heavy fight throughout the course of this campaign, and would fight tenaciously against the brutally savage invaders that are streaming into the land. But they, like the military forces before them, who would be attacked first and foremost, as well as also the American paramilitary forces in the area, would be savagely and brutally crushed in heavy combat. fighting would rage around farmlands, as cotton and corn were common crops in this particular area, as was ranching, as well as also battles raging over infrastructure targets and even inside of personal homes. In the assault on the airport, the International Air and Spaceport of Midland, the People's Armed Police would storm the terminal buildings in their stack teams and fight for every hallway, every lobby, every waiting area, every office, every bathroom, every janitor's closet in the entire building. As you can see in this animation or illustration, a stack team is in position and they're doing a high-low tactical maneuver around the corner to fire at this personnel here, trying to return fire, to lay down covering fire for this personnel to run across this open hallway. And the high-low is where they both come around the corner at the same time, one kneeling, one standing. They come around and lay down fire. One can fire this way and the other can fire that way, or both can fire this way, depending on target acquisition. And of course, as the People's Armed Police, like the military, were armed with the latest and greatest in drone and robotic technologies, the surveillance drones, essentially the quadcopter drones, in this particular PAP unit were at the squad level instead of the platoon level. As in the People's Armed Police, it was mixed, as some units had them at the platoon level, which was still relatively effective, adequate, but even more effective was having them at the squad level, so that the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had more eyes and ears in more places at the same time, as opposed to less, and was able to map the area in far more detail and in real time than it would be if there were platoon-level drones, which again were still relatively adequate, but it was far better to have them at the squad level, which meant that more could be seen in real time at the same time and processed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. As the airport was under assault, the potent air power would be used in key areas to completely annihilate ground targets that were not off limits for air and or missile strikes, as some targets were expressly forbidden for the air power to attack. As combat air patrols would be immediately undertaken by the highly advanced J-35A squadron, as well as the F-14 squadron. The actual air battle that would occur within this particular South Central invasion sector would essentially be the one air battle fought over the skies of Lubbock. As in this particular battle space, a KJ-2000, which was effectively an AWACS system, was essentially controlling the air battle that would take place many miles away, using its extensive, wide-reaching radar coverage to aid in the beyond visual range strikes that would be carried out by the other fighter aircraft engaging the then airborne American squadron. The KJ-2000 would fly safely over the Midland-Odessa area, protected by the likes of the F-14 and J-35A squadron. The electronic warfare jamming in this area, as the People's Armed Police as a ground force lacked EW capabilities, the PLAAF with this Y9LG would provide the electronic warfare capabilities over this battle space to jam redundant radio and radar communications, to blind the Americans, as all of their ISR capabilities and communications abilities would be completely eradicated in the opening moments of this war, with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, and in local battle spaces, use of electronic warfare assets, whether by air, land, and in some cases, by sea in coastal areas. The assault on the airport would be a sizable confrontation in terms of the firepower involved. The People's Armed Police would be in heavy combat for the international airport, which itself was of the absolute utmost importance, not only as a forward operating base, but as a massively important key logistical hub for future occupation and colonization operations. The artillery barrage from each artillery battalion of both brigades within the division would be massive and pinpoint accurate at the same time, as there were 6 firing batteries of Type 83 122mm howitzers in each firing battalion, along with a single battery of Type 59-I or -1 130mm howitzers in each artillery battalion, along with the headquarters battery, which was the command and logistical forces of each artillery battalion within each People's Armed Police brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division. As the People's Armed Police was mostly in a brigade structure by this point, there were still some divisional-sized elements, as mentioned previously, and these were generally People's Armed Police Reserve units, including this particular unit, which had not yet been completely reconfigured into single brigades and remained a division comprised of 2 brigades. Not only would the international airport be under heavy assault at the opening, but many other areas would be under assault as well, which included the municipal airport in Odessa, the military forces at the detention center / forward operating base in the south of Odessa along 385, the highway, and also the urban centers of Midland and Odessa themselves, as well as certain industrial targets and local infrastructure targets as well. The urban combat would also be hellaciously savage. Many would be cut down where they stood by a hail of fire from the light tanks, from their main weapons, coax weapons, turret-based weapons, as well as the infantry fighting vehicles, their very potent weaponry, as well as also even the APCs firing their heavy machine guns on their turret mounts. There would also be 10 Wing-Loong 2 dedicated combat drones, which effectively were flying ATGM carrying platforms, as well as also 10 Wing-Loong 3 dedicated combat drones, for a total of 20, dedicated combat drones over the Twin Cities area to give close air support and very accurate and precise air support to the ground forces if they needed more surgical options, as opposed to the absolutely devastating air power options available if they needed something that was more pinpoint as opposed to something that was more widely destructive, such as the airdrop munitions. Well, of course, there were precision airdrop munitions. Sometimes, as the saying went, it would be like killing a fly with a sledgehammer. That's where the dedicated combat drones and loitering munitions would come in, as also the CH-901A loitering munitions. For this particular division of the PAP were widely available in their TEL-like system, which was truck-based and 48-tubed, which could fire a salvo of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions in a single volley. These could be armed with fragmentation for dismounts, infantry-type forces, or light-skinned vehicles, or could be equipped with HE munitions, which were effective against many types of heavier armored vehicles. But then there were heat munitions, which were most effective against the hardest targets like main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and other such targets, and even light bunkers. These would be used in massive quantities in this particular operation by the People's Armed Police to support their operations, especially once engaged in combat over the international air and spaceport of Midland. More to come in the next video installation as the battle for the Midland International Air and Spaceport would be underway by 12:30 a.m. when both sides would meet on the field of battle.